I thought it was just a routine checkup until she smiled and whispered, "This needs more privacy." I had never been particularly anxious about doctor visits, at least not until I walked into this clinic. The waiting room was quiet, polished, and faintly scented with antiseptic and something floral I couldn't quite place. I tried to read a magazine, but my attention kept wandering to the office door at the far end, the one I knew led to the examination rooms. And then she appeared. She was everything I hadn't expected in a doctor. Not just beautiful, but confident, composed, and graceful in a way that suggested both experience and quiet kindness. She smiled at me, that small, knowing smile that made the tension in my chest ease a little and sent a subtle flutter through my stomach. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but assured. "I'm Dr. Langley. Please, come in." I followed her down the hallway, noticing the subtle details I hadn't before. The gentle sway of her hair as she moved, the way her blouse brushed softly against her skin, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered in her wake. I felt simultaneously self-conscious and oddly drawn in, as if the space around her carried a warmth I wasn't expecting. The checkup began like any other. Routine questions about my health, blood pressure readings, and minor tests. Yet everything she did seemed to carry a weight beyond professional courtesy. When she guided my arm into position for the blood pressure cuff, her fingers brushed mine just slightly, and I felt the warmth linger longer than it logically should have. I caught myself noticing the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, how they held a patience and gentleness that made the sterile room feel almost human. Small talk followed, but it wasn't superficial. She asked about my work and hobbies, listening with an attentiveness that felt rare and, frankly, unnerving. I wanted to speak naturally, but my words came out a little hesitant, as though I were aware of the subtle pull between us, something unspoken but undeniable. Her presence made the walls of the clinic shrink, her attention focusing entirely on me, and I felt both exposed and comforted. At one point, she paused to adjust a chart, and I noticed the quiet efficiency in her movements, the way she leaned slightly closer as if to ensure I understood her instructions. I realized my pulse had sped up, not from fear, but from a mix of curiosity, admiration, and something I couldn't yet name. By the time the appointment drew to a close, I was acutely aware of the lingering tension between us. There was nothing overt, no words, no gestures beyond professional propriety, but every glance, every slight touch, carried an unspoken resonance. I left the room with my head full of questions I hadn't expected to ask, and a strange, quiet anticipation for what might come next. I told myself it was foolish to read too much into a routine checkup. Yet, as I walked back through the waiting room, I couldn't shake the memory of her smile, warm, subtle, and lingering. It was the kind of smile that made ordinary moments feel charged, and ordinary days feel like they might hold something extraordinary just around the corner. The doctor's words caught me off guard, though she delivered them with the same calm, measured tone she had all along. "Some parts of the checkup need a little more privacy," she said, tilting her head slightly, the barest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. There was nothing flirtatious in it, yet the way she spoke made my pulse pick up, an inexplicable combination of curiosity and nervousness twisting in my chest. She led me down a narrow hallway to a smaller examination room. The lighting was softer here, warmer, almost inviting. The sterile, antiseptic smell was still present, but it was tempered by the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I realized I could feel my hands brushing the clipboard a little too tightly, and I caught myself adjusting my posture as if she were silently observing, which, in truth, she probably was. The room was compact, yet carefully arranged, every instrument in its place, the surfaces gleaming, the air calm. She gestured for me to sit on the examination table and did not rush. When she moved closer to check my posture, her hand brushed my shoulder lightly, almost accidentally, and I felt a warmth spread up my arm. It was such a small touch, and yet it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. As she explained the procedure, she spoke in that soft, steady voice that made it impossible to be distracted by anything else. She leaned slightly to demonstrate, and I noticed the subtle proximity, the way our shoulders were nearly touching when she adjusted my arm. There was a rhythm to her movements that was professional, deliberate, and yet profoundly human. I found myself acutely aware of the warmth of her presence, the gentle brush of her hair as she leaned slightly, and the quiet cadence of her breath. I tried to focus on the checkup, on the reason I was here, but the lingering awareness of her nearness made it difficult. Her fingers rested briefly on my arm to guide me into position, and I couldn't help but notice the softness, the quiet steadiness that contradicted the clinical precision of her role. I felt strangely exposed, not embarrassed, exactly, but sensitive, almost hyper-aware of every movement, every glance. There was a brief pause as she adjusted an instrument, and our eyes met. The silence stretched for a fraction longer than it should have, charged in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Her eyes were calm, kind, professional, but I sensed the same unspoken awareness I was feeling. My heartbeat thudded louder in the quiet room, and I became conscious of the warmth radiating from her body, the faint scent of her perfume, and the reassuring steadiness of her touch. When the procedure concluded, she stepped back with that same composed, gentle smile. "All done," she said softly. And yet, in that small, ordinary phrase, there was something more, a quiet acknowledgement that this moment, these small gestures, had not passed unnoticed. I left the room feeling lighter, yet restless, my mind replaying every brush of her hand, every fleeting glance, every subtle nuance that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. It was just a checkup, but somehow, it had stopped being just a checkup the moment she suggested more privacy. After the initial flutter of our private interaction, I thought the checkups would return to routine, the clinical professionalism resuming its usual rhythm. But the next appointment felt different. There was a softness in her demeanor that hadn't been there before, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it made the air feel warmer, more human. We sat across from each other, the usual formality in place, but her gaze lingered longer than necessary. She asked questions not only about my health, but about my life, about the stress at work, my hobbies, even small, personal routines. There was a sincerity in her voice that made it impossible to hide anything, and in turn, I found myself opening up more than I ever expected. At some point, she paused, glancing down at a chart, but clearly thinking of something else. Then, almost casually, she shared a personal anecdote, something small, a quiet memory from her own life that revealed a layer of vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. Her voice softened, her eyes momentarily distant, and I realized she wasn't merely performing her role as a doctor. She was letting me see a part of her no one else did. The moment struck me. It wasn't dramatic or heavy. It was subtle, like the first light of dawn breaking through clouds, but it carried weight. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers as she handed me a tissue for my own nervous cough, the slight crease at the corners of her eyes as she smiled gently, and the way she lingered just a fraction longer as she adjusted my posture. It was as if she were inviting me to see her as more than a professional, and I was both honored and unnerved by the intimacy of it. Her vulnerability made her approachable in a way I hadn't anticipated. I felt a protective instinct rise, a desire to offer comfort, yet I was careful not to overstep. Every gesture, from the soft press of her hand guiding my arm to the warmth radiating from her presence, was amplified by the realization that she, too, was human in her fears and quiet uncertainties. I caught myself observing every subtle detail, the calm steadiness of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with antiseptic, and the way her eyes, when they met mine, seemed to carry a silent understanding. It was a delicate balance, professionalism interwoven with a human connection that neither of us had fully acknowledged but both clearly felt. By the time the appointment ended, I was aware of a shift. The quiet charm, the understated warmth, the vulnerability she had allowed me to glimpse. It all made the ordinary checkup feel charged, meaningful. I walked out of the room feeling a new sense of connection, a delicate tension between admiration and something more profound, something that wasn't simply attraction but a budding emotional intimacy. It struck me then that what had begun as nervous curiosity was slowly transforming. I wasn't just intrigued by her presence anymore. I was drawn to her humanity, to the glimpses of vulnerability she allowed me to see, and to the silent trust forming between us. The following appointment felt different from the moment I stepped into the clinic. There was a quiet awareness between us now, an invisible thread that neither of us mentioned but both of us felt. The routine procedures unfolded as usual, yet every glance, every movement carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. I tried to focus on the charts, the monitors, the sterile hum of the office, but my attention kept drifting to her hands as they moved with effortless precision, the gentle curve of her smile, the way her eyes seemed to linger a beat too long. The tension was subtle, a whisper in the quiet room, yet undeniable. At one point, an instrument slipped from my grasp, a minor accident, but her reaction was immediate. She stepped closer, steadying my hand, and in that moment, our bodies were almost touching. Her hand on mine lingered a fraction longer than necessary, warm and reassuring. I felt a strange jolt, not entirely physical but emotional, a mix of surprise and something deeper, something that hinted at mutual awareness. I tried to pull back, mentally chastising myself for reading too much into a professional gesture, but it was impossible to ignore the electricity in the air. The way her eyes met mine, calm yet knowing, made my pulse quicken. There was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. Every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the slight step closer as she adjusted my posture, felt deliberate, intimate, and impossible to misinterpret. She asked me a routine question about my health, and I answered, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears. I was acutely aware of her presence, of the warmth radiating from her body, and of the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling more insistently in this smaller space. Even the ordinary sounds, the click of a stethoscope, the rustle of papers, were amplified by the charged quiet between us. There was a moment when she straightened up, our shoulders brushing lightly as she moved around me. My stomach tightened at the contact, and I became hyper-aware of every subtle signal. The way her fingers lingered on my arm as she guided me, the slight exhale she made when leaning in to adjust equipment, the soft intensity of her gaze. It was as though the world had contracted to the small room, to us, to the unspoken tension simmering just beneath the surface. By the time the appointment concluded, I was aware of an internal shift. My thoughts were a mixture of exhilaration and restraint, of desire and hesitation. There was a recognition now, unspoken but undeniable, that this connection went beyond mere curiosity or admiration. I felt drawn to her, yes, but more than that, I felt the pull of something mutual, something delicate, profound, and still carefully veiled beneath professional boundaries. I left the room with a quiet thrill buzzing under my skin, my mind replaying every brush of her hand, every lingering glance, every subtle signal that had passed between us. The ordinary checkup had become a charged dance of proximity and restraint, and I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this was only the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand, but already longed for. I hadn't expected the follow-up appointment to feel so personal. The room was the same, the instruments in their usual places, the air faintly scented with antiseptic and her subtle perfume. But this time, the atmosphere carried an almost tangible softness. She seemed more present, more attentive, not just to my health, but to me. "I notice you seem a bit tense," she said, her tone gentle, careful, as though choosing her words with deliberate kindness. "Do you want to sit for a moment?" Her invitation felt different than the routine professionalism of past appointments. There was no pressure, no rush, only a quiet offer of space. I sat on the edge of the examination table, and she pulled up a chair nearby. Our proximity was closer than usual, not intrusive but intimate, measured in a way that made my chest tighten with awareness. I found myself speaking more openly than I intended. I told her about work stress, about nights spent staring at the ceiling thinking of deadlines I couldn't meet. I spoke of small personal anxieties, of moments of doubt that had nothing to do with my physical health. And she listened, not just politely, but with the kind of quiet attentiveness that makes one feel profoundly understood. At intervals, she reached out with subtle gestures, her hand on my shoulder, a gentle squeeze when I expressed frustration. The warmth of her touch, brief as it was, grounded me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Each movement was deliberate yet tender, a balance of reassurance and restraint. The quiet weight of her presence settled over me, calming yet electrifying, like the hush before a storm breaks. There was a moment when she tilted her head, her eyes meeting mine in steady, unflinching gaze. I felt exposed, Not vulnerable in a threatening way, but open, raw, and accepted. The way she looked at me suggested that she recognized the complexity of my emotions, the hesitant curiosity, the cautious longing, without needing me to articulate it. Her subtle gestures, tracing a gentle line along my shoulder, brushing her fingers over my wrist to guide my hand, carried meaning beyond words. I was acutely aware of the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her touch, the soft exhale she gave as she leaned closer to explain a detail. Each interaction built a quiet, intimate connection, one grounded in trust rather than mere attraction. By the time our conversation drew to a close, I felt a shift I couldn't ignore. The tension that had existed in previous appointments had deepened, transformed into something richer, emotional intimacy intertwined with anticipation. I realized I wanted more than fleeting moments of connection. I wanted to be present for her as she had been for me, to understand her as she had begun to understand me. Walking out of the room, I felt the warmth of her gaze linger, a silent acknowledgement that this moment, the sharing of vulnerabilities, the gentle, reassuring touches, was not fleeting. It was the beginning of a trust that could evolve into something profoundly meaningful, delicate, yet undeniable, between two people navigating the quiet, slow-burning pull of connection. The day of the final checkup arrived with a quiet weight of anticipation. I wasn't sure why my steps felt heavier, or why my thoughts lingered on her smile long before I reached the clinic. There was a subtle nervous energy in the air, one I carried like a fragile secret. When she greeted me, her usual calm composure was softened by a warmth that made the sterile office feel unexpectedly intimate. The appointment progressed as before, methodical and professional, yet underlaid with an unspoken awareness. Every glance, every brush of her hand, seemed charged with meaning. I caught myself savoring the smallest touches, the way her fingers brushed my forearm as she adjusted the blood pressure cuff, or the brief, reassuring press of her palm against my shoulder. It was as if these gestures carried a language of their own, speaking volumes without words. As she concluded the checkup, she leaned slightly closer to guide me off the examination table. Her hand pressed lightly against my lower back, steady and warm, and I felt an unexpected rush of comfort and exhilaration. It was such a small gesture, so ordinary in appearance, but it carried the weight of all the quiet tension, trust, and mutual awareness that had been building between us. The warmth of her touch lingered as I descended the step, a subtle, grounding reassurance that left me momentarily breathless. Her eyes met mine, holding a soft intensity that was neither demanding nor intrusive, just present and patient. There was a pause, a moment suspended in time, where the ordinary boundaries of patient and doctor seemed to blur, replaced by a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of something unspoken. I became acutely aware of the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the clean air, the gentle cadence of her breathing, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she smiled at me. When I moved toward the door, she reached out again, her hand brushing mine in a gesture that lingered longer than necessary. I felt the warmth radiate from her touch, a silent promise of connection that required no words. My chest tightened, a combination of anticipation and quiet joy, and I realized that the moments we shared had become a safe space, intimate in its subtlety rather than overt in expression. The world outside the clinic seemed to rush in immediately after I left, but the memory of her presence, her touch, and her quiet, steady smile remained. My heartbeat settled, yet there was a lingering thrill, a realization that the slow-burning connection we had nurtured was no longer confined to small gestures. It had become a tangible, emotional reality. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what might come next, not in grand declarations or dramatic confessions, but in the simple, profound intimacy of shared presence, small touches, and mutual understanding. The delicate tension that had hovered for so long had finally found a foothold in something real, something warm, and something that felt entirely ours. The final visit had a weight to it that I could feel the moment I stepped into the clinic. I wasn't sure if it was anticipation, nervousness, or a quiet hope that had been building over the past appointments. The waiting room felt the same, clean, quiet, and faintly scented with antiseptic, but it no longer seemed distant or impersonal. Everything about the space had shifted because of her presence, because of the subtle intimacy we had cultivated together. She greeted me with her usual calm, measured smile, but there was something softer this time, something lingering that made my chest tighten with awareness. "Welcome back," she said, and in that brief phrase, there was warmth, acknowledgement, and a quiet invitation. Her eyes met mine with steady focus, carrying an unspoken understanding, and I realized that the distance that had once existed between us had collapsed in ways both gentle and profound. The checkup itself was routine, almost perfunctory, but every interaction carried layers of meaning. When she adjusted my posture, her hand brushed my arm with just enough pressure to communicate reassurance and presence. I noticed the subtle heat radiating from her skin, the soft exhale she released when leaning in to guide me, and the way her eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was a delicate dance of intimacy and care, one built on trust, attention, and mutual understanding. As the appointment concluded, she paused, stepping closer as if to ensure everything was in order. There was a moment, a suspended beat, where our proximity, the warmth of her hand on my back as she guided me toward the door, and the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the clinic air created a space that felt entirely ours. I felt a rush of emotion, not overwhelming, but profound, relief, joy, and the quiet thrill of connection. Then, she called me back, almost casually, for a small reason, perhaps a document she had forgotten. But the gesture carried weight beyond its practicality. I turned, meeting her gaze, and in that moment, everything felt suspended. She reached out, her fingers brushing my jawline in a gesture of tenderness, and I felt a warmth that spread from my chest to my fingertips. It was a fleeting touch, intimate yet respectful, the kind of touch that lingers in memory far longer than it lasts. We shared a quiet acknowledgement. No words, just a smile, a lingering look, and a shared understanding that the bond between us was real. My heart swelled with a sense of calm joy, a feeling of safety and connection I hadn't expected from what had started as a simple checkup. Walking out of the clinic, I carried the warmth of her presence with me. The ordinary world outside seemed brighter, slower, more attuned to the quiet possibilities of human connection. The slow-burning tension, the tender gestures, the shared vulnerabilities, all of it had coalesced into a delicate, fulfilling intimacy. I knew this was only the beginning, but it was a beginning built on trust, warmth, and the kind of emotional resonance that lasts far longer than fleeting passion. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope, gently, quietly, that what had started as a routine checkup had become the start of something deeply meaningful, something both tender and enduring, between two people who had discovered each other in the unlikeliest of spaces.